My parents were both killed in a hit and run car accident when I was 10. My dad was only 39 and my mom 35. Neither of them had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small church-going town where everyone knew one another. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune and so didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big city, so him and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go the orphanage route when they died, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringe-worthy like that. The Banks had their own daughter Kitty who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends, but Kitty had her own thing going and practically ignored me. She was a holier than thou type. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in town. In front of other people they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Kitty be nice to me in public, which she resented. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on crap on the internet or on trips. It was clear to me even as a tween and teen that the Banks were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest, they spent on themselves. As I grew older I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen and that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is an event, and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Kitty. When I was 17 I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Kitty's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the Banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them, and that once I got control of my inheritance, that I should be godly and generous, and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got lots of material, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store, and kept them for herself, gave them to Kitty, or to her other relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive, Baroque era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten the steak off those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how this china set will go to Kitty on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that, since I always dressed like a tomboy, didn't care about all my mom's antiques, that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, that I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things were things and not to obsess over them. So, having the Frau china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away. Wrong, lady. So, once Kitty went off to college thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. The rest, I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. Per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were haranguing me about how I owed them compensation, and since I was going to be rich soon I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years they probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused. I think they more than shared the wealth. I never promised anything, I just smiled and kept a tally of every single bank statement. I got them quarterly that my trust issued over the years. The bank's family never shared them with me, of course, but when I asked the actual bank for a rundown, they were more than happy to oblige. I also wrote down every single major purchase my foster parents clearly made over the past 7 years with money that was clearly beyond their means as a housewife and an insurance salesman. Things such as a $40,000 car for cash, a used $20,000 car for cash that they gave to Kitty, trips to Hawaii, New York, cash gifts to the church that made them look super generous at my deceased parents' expense. I kept it all in a nice 3-ring binder. I already arranged my travel to my new campus. I didn't have much stuff at the bank's house anyway and had zero intention of coming back, at least to their home. The banks knew I was leaving, but didn't bother seeing me off because they assumed I'd come back to give them their due. I waited for our church's yearly antique sale extravaganza, set to begin in 3 days. Per usual, the banks donated all sorts of random stuff, many of it knickknacks that used to belong to my mom and technically belonged to me. They weren't shy about giving away my stuff and taking credit for it. While Mr. and Mrs. Banks were on one of their shopping sprees with my parents' money and away from their house, I boxed up the china set and brought it to church. I told the rummage sale committee that Mrs. Banks wanted to donate the priceless antiques for sale, all benefits to go to the church. This donation is made in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks. I was being fair. If Mrs. Banks was really so godly, she would be delighted that such a wonderful donation be made in her name. Sadly, I knew she'd go the other way because she was faker than porn star implants. The ladies were flabbergasted, especially when I told them the appraisal of the set's value. I also told them that if they needed proof of ownership and right to sell, to contact the number of a certain attorney in New York. They thanked me profusely and praised the Lord Jesus for Mrs. Banks' generosity. This would be the most expensive item in their sales history. Everyone knew no one could afford to buy the set outright, but everyone would love to buy the pieces piecemeal. Like, I got a cup and saucer, or I got one of the chargers, I got an egg cup. The banks were supposed to work the sale the second day and I wasn't there. What I did hear was that my foster mom went ballistic when she saw her china set for sale, and that it was a huge hit, and ladies from all over the county had bought pieces of it, and it raised so much money for the church. My foster mom threw a tantrum and said that I had stolen the set from her house. The ladies at the church explained that I had made the donation in her name and she was getting credit for the donation to the church. My foster mom was practically yanking her hair out, according to what I heard later. She was trying to track down who had bought pieces and trying to get them back. Of course, she was unsuccessful. What she was successful in was looking like a grade A doucher bag. The entire church thought she was selfish and materialistic and acting very ungodly, especially the way she cursed her foster daughter. A week later, my foster parents received a package by registered mail from me and my attorney. It contained my binder where I showed my bank statements and also a list of all their spending extravagances. It also contained a warning from my attorney that should they ever try to contact me again for money, that they will receive a bill and a court date. That was that. 10 years later, I work as a 3rd grade teacher. I'm married to an accountant, and we have a 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. Kitty ended up working through college, and as we've gotten older, we've reconnected. She apologized for the way she acted when we were kids. We are friends now and see each other multiple times a year, often just for lunch. She's an elementary school teacher too, and married to an engineer. She has a 4-year-old daughter. Both of our older kids play together when our families meet. We both have our own wedding china. She has gone to a lot of therapy due to her toxic parents, she tells me. As for her parents, they still live in their small town because they are too broke to move. Their reputation is of being that couple who drove both their children away and stole money from that poor little girl whose parents died, and they tried to steal money from Jesus when they whined about getting their Baroque china back. I hope your Volvo was worth it, a-holes. Backstory. I'm sorry it's long, but some context is needed. When I was about 9 to 10 my parents got a separation, later a divorce, where my dad forced my mom to sell my childhood home, and my mom got main custody with my dad having us. They had me and my 4 years younger sister over every other weekend plus every other holiday. He moved out, only to immediately move in with a stepmonster and her 3 kids. The youngest was 2 years younger than me and a boy, the middle a year older than me, and female, and I'm not sure about the oldest age, but she was also female. I never interacted much with her. In an ideal world us 4 kids would have gotten along great, played together and whatnot. Or at least ignored the existence of the others. Sadly it's not an ideal world and that didn't happen. My sister got along with them just fine, I didn't. Maybe it was my then still undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome, maybe it was me not instantly going yay new family, but the step siblings didn't like me. They started bullying me, and my little sister joined, in cause she adored her new step family, and she was just 7 at the time. Over the first 6 months the bullying got worse and worse, until I broke and tried to call home and get picked up. At which point my dad decided to start confiscating my phone as the first thing he did when picking us up. The bullying escalated even more. There was nothing I could do. The step monster defended her precious demon spawn, calling me a liar and saying things like my kid said they didn't, whatever they did, or said to hurt me that day, or she's just lying for attention. During the next year I would try to run away from my dad's place a few more times to go to family. They lived less than 40 minutes walk away from an aunt and about 1,5 hours from my grandparents. Then my dad and the step monster moved over 2 hours by car away from where my mom lived. Things got so bad that I dreaded going to see my dad. Sitting at every dinner, the only time I would see my dad at that point between pick up and drop off, listening to my dad calling my mom a fat greedy pig and other evil things hurt. At 12 to 13 I was suicidal and numb, since I would only see the step monster, mostly when she told me to get the heck out and play or something. Just get out of the house. I tried telling her that I wanted to die, that I didn't want to keep living like this anymore. Her response? I don't care. Get the F***ck outside already. If you're going to kill yourself, do it outside. Not long after that I had a meltdown at school, crying for hours and unleashing the whole nasty tale onto them. Since my school was a good one, the teacher contacted CPS, who talked with me, ran some tests, and sent me to a psychologist. At some point they contacted my dad with their concerns for my mental and emotional well-being. My dad dealt with it by calling me, saying since you feel the need to lie like that, you shouldn't come visit anymore. Stay with your mom, I don't care. That was my last conversation with him, although I heard a lot about him and the step monster from my sister. Now, for my revenge. 10 years or so later I get a phone call from my dad's sister about him passing, car accident, and funeral. I went and I met the step monster again, obviously, widowed now, and my half brother for the first time. During the funeral and following wake she proceeds to insult me, my mom and the rest of dad's family. Then she starts complaining about how his name is on everything they had together, and how is she going to keep the house. It was paid down, but taxes and whatnot. Now, she never worked a day in her life, and such thing. Which is where my revenge comes to play. See, in my country the children of the deceased have a right to claim a minimum of $115,000 each, if there is that much money or value in good left behind and there is no will stating otherwise. Normally this claim comes after the deceased spouse also dies, or when they try to sell the property worth the money, whichever comes first. Normally. See, legally the children can claim it at any time, they just don't cause decency and pity for the widow. Too bad, I hate her guts, and both the youngest step siblings. As it so happens my dad and the step monster owned some award-winning show dogs, the house and land and a car. The step monster also got some insurance money, plus she will get a sum of about 60% of what my dad would earn if he was still alive every month. If my dad had a will she could have kept all of that for herself or my half brother. He didn't. And by that time my sister also hated her guts. So I talked to her and did the only thing I could think of. We took her to court to claim our inheritance. Sure, we got many looks of disgust and mutters of greediness, but in the end we won, and I got my share of the money. My sister got hers and our half brother got his, locked in a trust fund for when he turns 18. This meant that the house, dogs, and car had to be sold. The insurance money also got split. So us kids each got around $115,000 each in a trust fund for my half brother. As for the step monster, she got around $1,000 and the monthly sum of around $3,700. She was livid. Started screaming venomous sh*t, saying I should have killed myself when I was considering, and how is she going to live now? She have no house, and how dare you force me to sell Grimer, obviously fake name for my half brother's childhood home, and calling me a b*tch and other such things. The judge had to threaten her with contempt of court and get her escorted out before she stopped. Edit 1. Remove the acronym I used for step monster. And thanks for the support. 3. Edit 2. Someone asked about her reaction, so I added that. Edit 3. Grammatical errors. And holy shit, that's a lot of comments and upvotes. Thanks again you lovely people. Equals D. Edit 4. Some people have been commenting on the currency I've used in the post. I used dollars cause that's what most readers would understand. The actual sum we got was closer to 1 million each in our currency. Also, the dogs in questions got good homes and was not family dogs kept at home, plus the step monster did have the option to buy us kids out and kept them. This didn't happen to me, but it did to my grandmother, and it is one of the best stories I have ever heard in my entire life. Also, English isn't my first language, so sorry for any spelling mistakes. My grandmother grew up on a huge farm outside of a small town in Sweden. She is the second oldest out of 7 kids, 4 boys and 3 girls. Their parents were very respected in their community because of their farm and their products that they sold to the stores in the town. However, they were horrible to their kids and basically treated them like garbage. They were basically r/entit led parents and r/race-ed narcissists, and my grandmother told me stories about some of the things they did that almost made me cry. The dad, my great grandfather, beat his sons. This really effed all of them up, but especially the oldest of them, who ended up being as horrible as his father. Their mother, on the other hand, was just as bad. At times she refused to feed her kids because she thought they were too fat, and basically kept her daughters locked up on their farm so they could be as pure as possible, so that they could be married off down the road. The only times they ever really left their house was for school. My grandmother was pulled out of school when she was 13 years old to have her work and basically act as a mother over the rest of her siblings, or when they went out with either one of their parents or one of their brothers, because they were seen as the golden boys. They couldn't do any wrong. The kids couldn't really tell anyone about what was happening, as no one would believe them because of their parents' high status and social ties to the town. But despite her living situation, my grandmother kept her head high as she was growing up. She is the strongest woman I know. Because so many of the siblings had the same resentment against their parents, they would try to help each other as much as they can, and still try to find fun things to do. When my grandmother was 17, one of her younger brothers helped her out of the house and to the next town, where they occasionally hosted a dancing night, and there she just happened to meet the love of her life, my grandfather. According to my grandmother, they danced the entire night, and that it was one of the best nights of her life. They continued to meet in secret, as her parents would never approve of my grandfather because he was a lower class than my grandmother's family. My grandmother knew this very well, but she wasn't having any of it. Along with her siblings, excluding eldest brother, she planned out exactly what she was going to do to get away. Now, her mother owned this ridiculously expensive crystal duck. We are talking insanely expensive for this time period. Grandma arranged to be picked in the middle of the night. She was picked up by my grandfather's friend who owned a car, and she just left. But before she did that, she took the crystal duck with her. This was her petty revenge to her parents. In the previous post I said that my grandmother signed over her shares of the farm to her sister. Turns out this wasn't the case. My grandmother's sister signed over her share to my grandma. And so did the rest of the siblings, excluding the oldest son. This was done outside of their parents' and eldest son's knowledge. With my grandfather, she moved a few towns over, used the duck to get a loan at a bank, where she used the money to buy a small apartment where she and my grandfather lived, and then waited. My grandfather was drafted for the army and was gone for almost 3 years, and during those 3 years, my grandmother went to medical school and became a nurse shortly after at the local hospital. Then one day, she hears the news. Her parents are trying to sell the farm. After my grandma left, more of their kids decided to leave their parents too, and after a few years, they didn't have any money left and needed to sell their land. So my grandmother decides to talk to her parents after several years of not speaking to each other at all. My grandma takes her shares to the farm, which exceeds her parents and her brothers. She also takes her savings. She is the best person when it comes to saving and is able to save as much as she can, and she buys out her parents' and brothers' shares, making her the sole owner of the farm and the land it sat on. She tells her parents that they must leave her land and find somewhere else to live. She then reassigned the shares back to her siblings, excluding her older brother, due to things he did in the past, and one of her younger brothers didn't want his shares back because he didn't want anything to do with the family. Between the leftover siblings, they decide that the youngest sister would get to live on the farm as she was the only married one, and she was pregnant. My grandma and grandpa moved back to her original town. They got married, and shortly after they had my dad. To this day none of the siblings know what happened to the crystal duck, and oh god, the arguments they have had about it over the years, and the sly grin that would always form on my grandmother's face whenever someone mentioned it is priceless. My grandma didn't talk to her parents again after that. She didn't know where they lived or what they did after they moved out of the farm. Her mother tried to reach out to her when her dad died, but she didn't care, and later found out that her mom died a few years later. She didn't attend any of their funerals. She did find out where they are buried, mostly so she'd know where not to be buried. We have all been told by her that if they bury me at graveyard name, I'm coming back to haunt all of you. My grandma and grandpa were married 56 years before my grandfather passed away, and every year on their anniversary they went back to where they first met, where they still host monthly dances to dance. Thank you so much for watching the entire video. I would be so grateful if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. New videos every day.